Hi, everyone. It's been a few months since we reviewed this back in October of 2022. We found some new evidence, some very important evidence on this issue. And the issue here regards 1 Timothy 3:16. And the question will be, you have the quote there in front of you from the King James. Is this a fraud, or did it truly say originally God in 1 Timothy 3:16 that basically it was Jesus was God? So this would have settled the Trinitarian question immediately had this been in the Bible all these centuries from the very beginning. When did this come into existence? You can almost tell just reading it, it can't not be God because of what I'm going to show you. Let's read it in the King James Bible. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit. God needs justification in the spirit. That means he had to be a sinner who then needed a forgiveness. Very odd. Seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. So the last sentence, received up into glory, has to be Jesus, right? Yeshua. So when you look at it, you'd say, is there a different word that could be there in place of the word God that would erase this idea that God needed justification? And also, it's kind of unusual. That means Paul doesn't think Jesus was sinless. He's a man. He said, Jesus says, I'm a man. And he says that in John 8. He says 81 times he's the Son of Man. So Jesus thinks he's a human being. Let's just put it that way. He could be believed to be needing justification if he'd been a sinner. But you can't believe this of a person or an entity, a being that is God. He doesn't need justification. He is inherently just and doesn't have to abide by anybody's rules but his own, and he can't disobey his own words. I cannot lie. God, it says, cannot lie. So there's so many reasons why anybody looking at this would go, this cannot be how it originally read. Can we find out how it originally read? Some scribe couldn't even made this mistake, because if you're reading it, it's just implausible. You have to look at what your work product is and then fix it. Let's take a look at what happened here. Now, I'm titling this slide Revisiting 1 Timothy 3:16 from the 1611 KJV, because of Wornum's 1876 book mentions something. And then I put over there on the right, a fraud once recognized must never be forgotten. So the important thing here is that this error, this corruption, I think is a fraudulent, deliberate corruption. You'll see why. Well, exactly. I already showed you why. It doesn't fit. So if it is a corruption, it should have been erased and fixed by the King James committees that have been in existence at Cambridge and Oxford ever since to monitor and manage the production of the King James Bible ever since, the Authorized version. So why don't they fix this? So I'm going to suggest people go tell them to take a look at this video. They should know this already by now. I don't know why they don't fix it. Now, what intrigued me is I found something in Ralph Nicholson Warnum's book, Saul of Tarsus. He wrote it in 1877, so he's fresh on the heels of the Sinaiticus discovery. And so he went and read Tischendorf's book on that, and he came away with some information on this particular verse. Now, who, first of all, is Ralph Nicholson Wornum? I'm just going to give you the brief first paragraph there. He was a British artist, art historian, and administrator. He was the keeper and secretary of the National Gallery of London from 1855 until his death. So he held a very high, significant office within the British official entities, governmental entities, running the National Art Gallery, as if you will. Now, here's what he has in his book, Saul of Tarsus, page 230, 1877. And then he cites on the left, 1 Timothy 3:16. I'll use my cursor to show you, see? As to the passage in the first to Timothy, quote, God was manifested in the flesh. This is something more than a misinterpretation. It is a falsification of the text by a Macedonian bishop of Constantinople, though it is still retained in our Authorized version, meaning the King James. Macedonius changed OH, who, into the word meaning who, into that's a THEOS. Okay, so God. So that's the corruption. Where does he put a footnote? So he has a little asterisk there. So you go to the asterisk. It says, see Tischendorf's New Testament, Novum Testamentum, Volume 2, page 850, 8th edition, 1872. So that was a book released 5 years earlier. So he's done his work. He's a studious student of the Bible, and he also detected this corruption. Now you have to know he himself is a Trinitarian. So Wornum is not telling you this because he uh, has given up his beliefs in the Trinity. He's definitely defending it, but he's trying to say this passage of Paul is not to be credited or to be used to determine what Paul's actual doctrines were on the Trinity. And he proves from what he calls the more authentic epistles of Paul that Paul did not ever speak this way. He denied that Jesus was God in multiple places. So, and that was particularly in the Corinthians passage where God puts everything under Jesus. And then he makes a point, Paul makes a point, but God is not under Jesus himself. So clearly Jesus and God are distinct in Paul's mindset and the way he looks at things. Anyway, let's keep going here. Now, who first made this very well known? Okay, so this happens in the 1690s period. So it's after the time of the King James Bible, but I'm going to show you some of his evidence, and you have to wonder, did not the King James Bible people already know what he's saying here? Okay, so he's pointing out when it says God was received up into glory, this obviously has to be Jesus. So if this is the way it reads, then the Trinity is solved. We know it's fact. But is this verse there, as the King James leads us to believe? And still, to this day, leads us to believe. How many? What's the high percentage of Christians that read that King James? It's supposed to be over 55%. It was the last reading I saw, 63% before that, and I've even seen as high as 87% in earlier times. So it's fading in its importance, but it's still a very influential book. So what would be the implication if you put God there? Because you have to use the word God as a prefix to all the subsequent sentences or phrases. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh. God was justified in the spirit. Wow. Like I've said, that's incredible to believe of God. God was seen of angels. That's okay. God was preached unto the Gentiles. Who could that be? And Yahweh was preached to the Gentiles, so that would be not a big deal, not controversial. Being seen of angels, not controversial. God was believed on in the world. Okay, that could be Yahweh too. Then it says, God was received up into glory. Wow, that has to be Jesus. So now we know Jesus is God, no doubt, right? But like I said, Tischendorf, why is Tischendorf looking and researching this and reconfirming something that Isaac Newton talked about in the 1690s? And he's doing that in the 1870s. Why would he be doing that? So I figured he might have found it in the Sinaiticus Bible. Was wrong. And that's exactly why he wrote about it. Now, on the right side of this are the Logos software online version. So the online version is free, by the way. Okay, but then it doesn't come with all the bells and whistles. But you can download the modules, and so I downloaded the Sinaiticus module. I think it actually was free. As I recollect. So I could see right there. I put an arrow on the right. If you look there, it is. Okay, on the right here, you can see this arrow, and you see the that's a H sound or O sound, os, and it means who. Now, who here makes perfect sense. Who was manifest in flesh? It doesn't say God. It just says who was manifest, and then you figure out it's Jesus. And here is the Bible Hub. It now itself, Bible Hub itself concedes that what it really is the word meaning who, O-S. And so it's clearly able to be fixed because we can see the earliest codex we have that includes First Timothy, and that's key because we have the books of the Syriac Sinaiticus, of Agnes Lewis, the Curiton. These are all book recoveries from earlier periods of time of just the Gospels. So that's important. If you want to do gospel studies that are earlier, we have earlier versions of them than even the Sinaiticus. And that's what we've talked about here on this channel. So from approximately the 200s is the Agnes Lewis edition. And I disagree with those people who claim it's later in time. No, it's earlier in time because it clearly shows an earlier version of the birth account of Jesus. Sir Isaac Newton will call this a pious fraud, meaning people who justify lying for the Bible to expand God's truth. And this all stems from Romans 3:7. And if you read in the Mount's Transliteral, or the reverse interlinear, if you use the technical term, this work just puts it point blank right in front of your face in a very accurate translation. But if by my lie, God, this is Paul writing, but if by my lie, God's truthfulness abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? This is a clear justification of lying for the gospel. And you're going to say, well, you don't believe that or whatever. This is what the church believed. So whether you see it or not, this is what the church believed, and created a whole doctrine around it called the pious fraud doctrine. This is not a verse without consequence. And if you want to claim it doesn't mean what it says, you just have to read how other people have read it for centuries when they're closer in time to the Greek. They're not missing what it says. And this is what's called casuistry in Roman Catholicism. And then this is just an introduction from now I did a prior video on Sir Isaac Newton. I'm not going to repeat all of that. I'm just giving you the highlights and the slides I used in that episode. So he exposed this in 1690. Okay. And he went and reviewed things. And I'm just going to say, if you read this, when you watch this video that I have, or you just look at these slides here, you realize that he's saying the evidence was overwhelming even before he wrote in 1690, and he's the one collecting all the evidence. So the question I have is did the 1611 translators know none of this? And it's possible they didn't know it, because you have to be studious. And Sir Isaac Newton is a man with a lot of time, because he's a famous scientist and he's done all these wonderful discoveries, and he's apparently making some money. And he loves the Bible, and he starts studying corruptions, and he's not a fan of the Trinity, and he knows that there are Bible passages that don't make sense. And he's the one who said, when you just looked at it, it couldn't, 1 Timothy 3:16 can't mean what it sounds, because how can God be justified in the Spirit? He doesn't need that. He doesn't sin. Anyway, so he goes through the Latins and whatever, and he shows you there was a change in the Omicron by making it look like a theta by putting a little crossbar of dots. And then when you have Omicron S by itself, it would mean who, which would make perfect sense. Who was taken up into glory. But when you put a little crossbar in the Omicron and make it into a theta, the theta and the sigma, the S over here, you have the, and the ending S is considered, that people use that as an abbreviation for THEOS. See over here what a THEOS would have looked like in Greek. So somebody had the bright idea, hey, I can squeeze in where it simply is saying Omicron S, os meaning who. I'm going to change it into to THEOS, but in the abbreviation, because I don't have enough room, I'm just going to squeeze it in by just putting these few little dots in the middle of the Omicron. It'll look like a theta. Okay, so that's what he said, and it's very diabolical, frankly, to have done that, because now it doesn't fit the sentence. The Theos needs justification in the Spirit. I don't think so, but that's how it reads now. And Sir Isaac Newton also made an argument that should have been convincing to the translators of the King James Bible, because in the first 5 centuries, nobody ever argued this point about 1 Timothy 3:16, which would settle the whole debate if you believed in Paul, right? So if this was somebody that the church was respecting, which presumably it was at some point in time, then why even debate the Trinity? You've got him saying God was taken up into glory. End of story. But he points out nobody ever made this argument, which means it wasn't there. I mean, we literally know it wasn't there from the manuscripts that it pre-exist the Trinity dispute. We also know that nobody made the argument during the whole time period of the Trinity dispute. Let's see what he says here. So then the falsification, this is Isaac Newton. So then the falsification or falsation was set on foot in the beginning of the 6th century and is now of about 1200 years standing. For though Beza tells us that all the Greek manuscripts read Theos, yet I must tell Beza's readers that all his MSS read Omicron. For he had no other MSS on the epistles besides the Claromontan, and in this manuscript, as Morinus by ocular inspection has since informed us, the ancient reading was Omicron with the little sigma. os, who. But yet in another hand and with other ink. So he said, when you look carefully, you can see that it originally said Omicron S, and somebody cleverly put in the little dots or the line in the middle of the Omicron. The letter theta has been written out of the line, and the letter Omicron thickened to make a sigma appear. Oh, that's interesting. So the person actually changed an Omicron into a sigma because he had to squeeze that in. Oh my gosh. Which instance shows sufficiently by whom the ancient reading has been changed. Yeah, by a corrupt person who's totally trying to make it come out to say theos by even creating the sigma that isn't even there out of an Omicron. Let's see what else he says here. The letter Omicron was thickened to make a sigma appear, which instance shows sufficiently by whom the ancient reading has been changed. Valesius also read Omicron in one of the Spanish MSS, and so did the author. I think that's an Omicron sigma is what that means together. In one of the Spanish MSSs, and so did the author of the Oxford edition of the New Testament, AC 1675, in the MS manuscript of Lincoln College Library, which is the oldest of the Oxford manuscripts. The Alexandria manuscript, that's the Alexandrinist, and one of the Colberts and Cyril, chapter 12, Scholiorum, Teste Fotio MS Com in Epistolas. I mean, look at the study. He has it. Reads Omicron S. So that means who? So the Alexandrinus. So he has the benefit of the Alexandrinus, and that's about 1627, is a gift given by the Egyptian church to the King of England, and it goes into the Oxford Library. I think it's the Oxford Library. So the Alexandrinus at his time was considered the oldest, and that was oldest codex, and that was from the 400s. And now we have an earlier one, which is the Sinaiticus that Tischendorf discovered in the 1840s, and that gives us, again, I've just shown you evidence that it said os all along, did not say theos, reads omega sigma. So then there are some ancient Greek manuscripts which read Omicron, and others read Omicron sigma. Okay, yes, okay, so I had it right. Omicron by itself can simply mean who, but in other times it has to have the Omicron S. So it has its own abbreviation of O, and it could be Omicron or Omicron S. But I do not hear of any Latin ones, either ancient or modern, which read theos. So yeah, so whoever's translating it from Greek to Latin never thought it was theos. They were reading something that read to them as who, and that's why he can say without a doubt that's what it originally read as. And here's where he goes into the justified in the spirit as conflicting with the meaning of theos. Doesn't make sense. And he says this is Sir Isaac Newton. And besides, to read theos makes the sense obscure and difficult. For how can it properly be said that God was justified in the spirit? But to read Omicron or Omicron S and interpret it of Christ as the ancient Christians did without restraining it to his divinity makes the sense very easy. For the promised and long expected Messiah, the hope of Israel, is to us the great mystery of godliness, and this mystery was at length manifested to the Jews from the time of his baptism and justified to be the person whom they expected. And then he continues, I have now given you an account of the corruption of the text, the sum of which is this. The difference between the Greek and the ancient versions puts it past dispute that either the Greeks have corrupted their manuscript or the Latine, Syrians, and Ethiopians their versions, and it's more reasonable to lay the fault upon the Greeks than upon the other three for these considerations. So what he has proven is if you looked at the Ethiopic text, the Syrian text, and the Latin text, they all had who. And then you have some ancient versions in Greek that would say theos. And he's saying, so when you compare these two streams, which makes more sense, that the Latins, Syrians, and Ethiopians all got it wrong by always having it who and never as theos? Or did the Greeks, who only in the later period of time have theos, and in the beginning they had who? So it's obvious that the later Greek texts are the wrong ones and are what he calls corruptions, which means they're deliberate. This is not a mistake. And then he says this: it was easier to change a letter or two in the Greek than the 6 words in the Latin. So to make it all fit in the Latin, you would have to add 6 words. Okay, that's what he's saying. In the Greek, the sense is obscure and the version's clear. It was agreeable to the interests of the Greeks to make the change, but against the interests of the 3 nations to do it, and men are never false to their own interests. The Greek reading was unknown in the times of the Arian controversy. So we was talking about the Greek reading is now this THEOS reading of what has explained is actually from the 6th century on, from the 500s. The Greek reading was unknown in the time of the Arian controversy, which is what? The 325 era, the time of Nicaea. So again, had this been a verse, it would have been brought up at Nicaea because it would be the antidote to the Arian doctrine that Jesus was a man indwelled by God, but not himself God. There are no signs of corruption in the versions hitherto discovered, but in the Greek we have showed you particularly when, on what occasion, and by whom the text was corrupted. And I haven't given you all that detail. I'm just giving you the conclusions he's done. And it's just more of the same here. Let me just see. Yeah, more of the same. And but hey, there it is. The King James is got it wrong, but Mouncey's got it right. Mouncey says who, and look who else gets it wrong. A modern Bible, my Bible with all the knowledge you know about this verse, and they have it wrong. World English Bible, and I respect them so much because they're the only Bible on Bible Gateway that restores the name of Yahweh to its proper place. Now you do have the Young's Literal that has, and I think the American Standard, they use Jehovah, but Jehovah I don't believe is correct, and I think the Jewish people don't believe it's correct either. That was not used in any Bibles until I think it was Galatinist used it in the 1400s or something like that. So it's actually a made up term, a made up pronunciation. Although there's some people who defend it, I've heard Nehemiah Gordon defend it, but it should be Yahweh. Anyway, the point is, World English Bible should know better. They preserve the word Yahweh, and it's a real kudos for that. But this is wrong. Why don't they know it's a fraud? See, how are they duped, and why would they let themselves be duped? Because they want to believe in the Trinity doctrine? I hope not. That's not the right reason. You have to have evidence that this verse is in controversy, and it's beyond doubt that it is not original. It has been corrupted. But yet, look what's going to happen to people. They're going to be misled by this verse. It's it's a conclusive resolution of the Trinity problem. See, few little dots corruptly added into a Omicron can change your view on the Trinity in a heartbeat, and that's why they don't want to give it up. All right, so that's it. I hope this helps everybody. And this is one of those things. What did I say in the very beginning? I want to go back. We need to always keep remembering the corruptions. A fraud once recognized must never be forgotten. And so we will remind you again about this as we find more evidence or more proof of it. But the evidence is overwhelming. It was from Sir Isaac Newton's time. It should have never been in the King James. Beza, and I actually want to remind you, Beza lied. This is what, by the way, Sir Isaac Newton is not is not pulling punches. He says that Beza lied. Let me just read this to you again. Beza is the leader of the Calvinist party after Calvin dies. He's in Geneva. He's got control of a couple of manuscripts, and but in terms of the epistles, that's not in every manuscript. So the manuscripts he had, according to Sir Isaac Newton, was the Claromontan and the Morinus. No, the Claromontan and Claromontan, and then his friend Morinus or somebody famous did an ocular inspection, meaning looked at it and said, hey, no, it's Omicron and not the letter theta. So even there, Beza, he's saying, is lying to you. Why would Beza lie? Because he wants to believe in the Trinity, but not only wants to believe it, but his party actually executed Servetus, who wouldn't say that Jesus was the eternal Son of God. He said he's the Son of God, the Father dwells in him. He even says he's God without being an eternal Son of God. You can't be an eternal Son of God because it's a contradiction in terms. and yet they burned him at the stake alive, and they used the freshest wood, so it would take the longest time to torture him the longest. And they were fully expecting him, by that kind of torture, that he would eventually confess that Jesus was the eternal Son of God. But to their dismay, he prayed, "No, I'm praying to the Father in the name of the Son of the eternal God." And so he was willing to die. This medical doctor, who had been very successful and written books that were made his lifestyle very comfortable, in science. He's discovered the science of pulmonary respiration, the first scientist to do so, and he's the one that Calvin is sneering at, and so is Farrell, to see him die at the burning at the stake. And I got to tell you why. Why did the church believe you could lie and also torture people to believe in the Trinity? Because of what Paul said. If you can lie, I want you to see the rationale for torture. You may not see it right away, but I'm going to show it to you. Those of you who read or know the story of Servetus, which is a very big tragedy, if you ask me. Where is that passage? It's here. If you can tell people, if by my lie I've convinced someone to accept the truth of God, why am I a sinner? So then I have to say to you, if I tortured somebody to finally get them to confess Christ is God, which is actually a torture that there was a guy, I have an article on a gentleman torturing people to make them confess the Trinity. Why am I called a sinner? I'm doing God's holy work. I'm torturing and lying people for God. What don't you get from that? That everything justifies that. I'm saving their souls for eternity. So what? I'm causing them physical pain. So what? I'm lying to them. I'm saving their souls. You really are. They really think this. Tricking people into believing in God is not the way to believe people to God. Yeah. And torturing them is just beyond belief. But that's what they believed. And that's the era we need to realize we are coming out of. And we need to realize the past involved that level of perversion and corruption and deliberateness and evil, literally, to create false beliefs. All right. God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.